This is Franklin Rye, and welcome back to Political Spirits. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, I haven't told you any lobbying stories for a while, so let's start with one of those. As you know from a couple of episodes ago, I have horrendous handwriting. It's been a running joke among the assistants I've had over the years, to the point that they would brag about being able to read my handwriting as evidence of just how talented they were. So what does that have to do with lobbying? Well, you've all heard about the process of passing legislation being referred to as the sausage-making process, because if you like sausage, you don't want to see it being made. And if you like legislation, you likewise don't want to see it being made. Some things are just better left unseen, or so the story goes. The process is just too slimy and ugly to view. Well, I remember one time when I negotiated amendments to a piece of legislation with the Texas Insurance Commissioner during a legislative committee hearing. The amendment literally consisted of my handwritten notations in the margins of the bill itself. It passed the vote in committee in that form, and then was formally written up and distributed. Now, luckily, we had a local lobbyist who was working the issue, so if Legislative Services had read my horrendous handwriting and come to some insane interpretation of it, at least we would have caught it. What happens when such handwritten changes are made and there isn't a local lobbyist to double-check it? Now that's when the sausage-making analogy applies. In fact, I like to think of it as the chum-making process, because that's an even more slimy and disgusting process than making sausage. I remember I used to do some inshore saltwater fishing, and one time I decided to make homemade chum. Now the thing that made it really interesting when I made that homemade chum is that between the two buddies that came fishing with me, one of them had a very weak stomach. So I took a 5-gallon bucket, filled it over halfway with salt water, not the clear blue offshore kind, but rather the tannin-stained inshore stuff that looks like a cup of coffee. And then I dumped 3 or 4 loaves of broken-up bread and a couple of containers of Quaker oats into the bucket. Then it got really fun. I opened up and ladled out 12 cans of Cozy Kitten cat food. Just think of the cheapest, grossest cat food you'd ever find at Walmart, and then imagine something twice as gross and half as expensive. That's Cozy Kitten, the preferred cat food of all saltwater fishermen. Then I opened and dumped in 5 cans of jack mackerel. What's that? Think of giant sardines in a can like a can of cranberry sauce. Just open one end and shake it, and the contents kind of fall out with a disgusting slurping sound. Only it doesn't come out like cranberry sauce in the shape of a cylinder. It comes out as giant slimy sardines surrounded by something halfway between Jell-O and jelly, but smelling like the gutters in New Orleans after Fat Tuesday. Now, the one fishing buddy with the weak stomach kept staring at me as I would dump ingredient after ingredient in the bucket, with a look similar to that on the faces of the tourists in Ace Ventura When Nature Calls, after Jim Carrey slides out of the backside of a simulated rhino. Thorough disgust. Well, I brought all those ingredients, but the one thing I forgot was a giant ladle or something similar to stir it. So what did I use? Well, with nothing else to choose from, I just shoved my entire arm down into the mixture and started stirring away. Halfway through, I lifted up my arm, with the goo dripping off its length, and looked up at my fishing buddy and squeezed a big handful of Cozy Kitten cat food through my fingers and exclaimed, "Dinner's almost ready!" He immediately started uncontrollably dry heaving, and my other fishing partner started uncontrollably shaking because he was laughing so hard. That's the best representation I can think of for the crafting of legislation. It isn't pretty, but like making chum, it can yield very positive results, whether in the form of compromise legislation that resolves a serious dispute, or in the form of a boatload of fish. Either way, problem solved. Next topic. saying goodbye to a hero and an honorable man. On November 30, we lost a war hero and a truly honorable man. George H.W. Bush, the 41st President of the United States, passed away at 94 years of age. I knew the day would come, but sometimes he seemed so incredibly durable that he'd somehow avoid his inevitable passing. Many know the story of how George H.W. Bush was shot down at sea in World War II and then rescued. Bush had enlisted on his 18th birthday. At the time he became a pilot, he was the youngest pilot in the Navy. He was shot down on a bombing mission where he was at the helm of a Grumman TBM Avenger bomber on a mission to take out a Japanese radio tower on the island of Chichijima. His plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire and seriously damaged, but he completed his bombing run and bombed the radio transmitter. Afterwards, the plane was too damaged to return to the aircraft carrier San Jacinto, and Bush gave the order to bail out. In the end, only he survived. His crewmen did not. He was rescued by an American submarine. You can actually find video of that rescue on YouTube. CNN also published a moving video of Bush going back to the site of the crash in 2002. I encourage you to watch both videos. George H.W. Bush received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his bravery. He was an American hero. In the April 27, 2015 edition of Chicago Mag, there's an article by Carol Felsenthal entitled White House Staffers Dish on What the Obamas, Clintons, and Bushes Are Really Like. The article is about Kate Anderson Brower's book entitled The Residents Inside the Private World of the White House. The author, a former White House reporter for Bloomberg News, interviewed numerous White House staffers about the former presidents and life in the White House. The Chicago Mag article notes that the White House staff's favorite first couple was the George H.W. Bushes. The article also notes that is, quote, perhaps because they grew up in homes that had servants, and perhaps because they genuinely seemed to like talking to and getting to know the people who cooked and cleaned for them. Barbara Bush would visit and chat with the florists. The president would play horseshoes with staffers. Close quote. I find the speculation that the George H.W. Bushes socializing with their staff and truly getting to know them being a result of their having had servants in their homes in the past to be interesting. I wouldn't think that everyone would accept that wealthy persons necessarily treat staff well because they've had personal staff in the past. That certainly doesn't fit the stereotype. It makes me wonder whether that speculation was inserted to help minimize the fact that the overall most positive assessment by staff was being directed at a Republican president and his First Lady. My experience tells me that when people are that engaged with getting to know staff members who attend to their personal needs, even when those persons are far below them in social and economic strata, it's because those people, in this instance George H.W. and Barbara Bush, genuinely like people. I think it's that simple. Next topic. The changing characteristics of presidents. Will Donald Trump be reelected in 2020? I don't know. It's too early to tell. 6 months ago, my prediction was that he would be reelected. My confidence in that prediction is a bit lower now than it was then, but I still believe it will happen. Having said that, it really is too early to tell. So if Donald Trump doesn't get reelected, what will his replacement be like? Or if Trump does get reelected, what will the president elected in 2024 be like? Well, based on what has happened over the last several presidential elections, I predict the next president will have a significantly different personality than Donald Trump. The question will simply be whether that occurs in 2020 or in 2024. What do I mean by significantly different personality, and why do I say that? Well, look at President George H.W. Bush, who passed away this past week. He was an honorable man and a World War II veteran to whom we all owe a debt of gratitude. He was also not particularly charismatic. Bush was extremely experienced, having held a multitude of government positions, including congressman, ambassador to the UN, U.S. envoy to China, director of the CIA, vice president, and finally president of the United States. The knock on Bush was that he understood and was devoted to foreign policy, but that he was never fully committed to domestic policy in general and the economy in particular. As only a moderately effective communicator as presidents go, and one clearly lacking in charisma, he had a hard time defending himself against that charge. So who replaced him? Bill Clinton, a man in possession of more than his fair share of charisma. The former governor of Arkansas had no federal government experience. He was also so smooth and persuasive that he was derisively labeled Slick Willie. In those respects, he was the opposite of George H.W. Bush. So who replaced Bill Clinton? George W. Bush, a man who was known as someone you'd like to have a beer with, but was not charismatic. Unlike Bill Clinton, who was extremely adept at answering questions in press conferences and was capable of speaking for seemingly endless periods of time, even when the wrong speech was displayed on the teleprompter, George W. Bush was not a particularly adept practitioner of the spoken word. He even made up his own on occasion. Does strategery ring a bell? In those respects, he was the opposite of Bill Clinton. So who replaced George W. Bush? Barack Obama, a professorial man in his demeanor, whereas George W. Bush was known to shoot from the hip and to mangle the English language. Barack Obama was the calm, erudite, well-spoken sophisticate. In those respects, he was the opposite of George W. Bush. So who replaced Barack Obama? Donald Trump, the brash businessman dripping with braggadocio, the billionaire who could speak to the bass fishermen. He was definitely not a calm, erudite, well-spoken sophisticate. In those respects, he was the opposite and is the opposite of Barack Obama. What does all this mean? It means that it looks like we easily get sick and tired of our presidents. They wear on us, and we replace them with their opposites. Only one of the recent presidents didn't serve 2 terms. In that respect, it seems that we tired of George H.W. Bush in only 4 years. However, don't forget that George H.W. Bush lost to Bill Clinton in the year in which Ross Perot ran an unusually successful independent candidacy. If not for Ross Perot's run, most people accept that George H.W. Bush would have won re-election. So if the pattern is followed, barring an independent candidacy of real impact against Donald Trump, President Trump will be re-elected in 2020 and replaced in 2024 with someone who is his opposite in many respects. We'll have to wait and see. Next topic. Some interesting speculation about the future. We've all heard the phrase, demography is destiny. It's been used to argue that the Democratic Party will be in a position of permanent power in the near future. Some have even argued that the period was to begin with the election of Barack Obama as president. The election of Donald Trump proved otherwise, at least as to timing. I would also argue that the assumption that Hispanic voters will continue to vote for Democrats in numbers comparable to those from which President Barack Obama benefited is misplaced. I would also argue that the Republican Party has a real opportunity to make inroads in the black community with African American males. However, those subjects have already garnered a great deal of discussion and commentary. What I want to talk about is developments in the future which will impact the economy and perhaps where we live, and which therefore will impact party politics. Automobile ownership has been woven into the fabric of American society since the first half of the 20th century. Historically, obtaining a driver's license has been a rite of passage for teenagers in the U.S. In years past, virtually every teenager, when they reached the age of 15 or 16, was insistent on obtaining a learner's permit and then a driver's license once the minimum requirements had been met. I can tell you from personal experience that not every teenager now takes that approach. A surprising number put off obtaining a license, sometimes even for years, because it just doesn't mean as much to them now as to teenagers in the past. Why? Well, it seems that texting and Snapchat and other social media have reduced the need for teenagers to see their friends face to face. For many teenagers, if they don't need to travel to see their friends, then they don't need a car. Well, that certainly can reduce costs and anxiety for parents, but what does that mean for the economy? Think about how much automobiles drive the economy. Not just the sale of automobiles themselves, but the businesses and their employees who service and arrange for the servicing of the vehicles, the insurance companies and their agents who provide and sell auto insurance, the aftermarket suppliers which customize automobiles, the tire and auto parts manufacturers that manufacture and sell auto parts, the car wash businesses, and a nearly endless stream of businesses and their employees who rely on widespread ownership of automobiles. Think about all the restaurants which rely on people driving to the restaurant in their own cars. I have a quirky theory that the economy has been even more dependent on the automobile than I just described. Before the advent of smartphones and social media, guys would work harder to advance or work extra hours to buy the more impressive, faster car to impress women. They'd rent bigger apartments to hold parties to meet women. Now they just go on social media. How much adverse impact has that already had on the economy? How much more adverse impact will it have in the future? Obviously, I'm not suggesting that we somehow restrict usage of social media for the good of the economy. I'm just saying that we really need to be aware of the impact I suspect it is having. I haven't seen a study on this point, but if I find one, I'll bring it to your attention. So what will these changes mean from a political perspective? Well, I read recent speculation that in 10 years we won't own automobiles. The speculation is that instead we'll all hold memberships in services like Uber, which will provide driven vehicles on request. Do I believe that? Well, I think it's exaggerated to get attention. Unfortunately, that seems to be the norm these days. But if you take the 10 years and stretch it out to something more like 20 years or more, and you replace the all with huge numbers of Americans, especially urban dwellers, then I do believe it. Long term, I believe large numbers of Americans will no longer own automobiles and will instead rely on such services. Do I look forward to that time? Not really. The automobile has given Americans and others around the world much of the freedom that we've come to take for granted. Think about it. If you own your own car, you can hop in it and drive around at any time. Maybe you plan to go to dinner and just don't know where. Maybe you just want to explore some new areas you've never visited around your home. If you live near some beautiful natural areas, maybe you just want to take a drive in the country. Are you really going to do that if you have to contact a service like Uber? I don't think so. But what if the Ubers of the future offer a flat membership fee monthly for unlimited use? Well, then you might. But how much will that monthly fee be? And how will the service handle the demand? I suspect to control price there will be restrictions which effectively discourage travel other than to a specific destination. In other words, when you want to go from point A to point B, you're good. But if you just want to drive around, it's either going to cost you or you're going to have to arrange it way ahead of time. Either way, the freedom associated with the automobile, especially historically in America, will either be on the decline or disappear. In its place will be reduced responsibility for maintenance and elimination of the upfront expense of buying a car. Will the exchange be worth it? Well, Americans and the rest of the world will decide that, but it's not something to which I look forward. So what will that mean politically? I suspect it will mean that Americans will become more accepting of government regulation, because the loss of the wide-open freedom to travel that comes with car ownership will gradually reduce somewhat Americans' expectations as to individual freedom of movement. In that respect, those who live in the suburbs will become more used to waiting for transportation, like those who rely on public transport in the cities. And that change in mindset may manifest itself in acceptance of greater levels of regulation, just as we often see among urban dwellers. If attitudes change in that way, which party will it favor? I think, unfortunately, it has to favor the Democrat Party. The more American attitudes on average become more like those who reside in the cities, the more likely the Democrat Party benefits. Moreover, if Americans are relying on services from companies like Uber rather than owning their own vehicles, the production of automobiles will likely drop dramatically. If that happens, we should expect the per-unit cost of automobiles purchased by individuals to increase. We should also expect that the extensive car manufacturer dealership network will also shrink. As a result, the comparative cost of living in rural areas or the distant suburbs, often called exurbs, will increase if there is not a sufficient supply of vehicles from companies like Uber in those less populated areas. If that occurs, those populations will need to buy their own cars, even though if they lived in the city or in the closer suburbs, they wouldn't need to. What might that cause? It might cause a move into the cities or the closer suburbs from the exurbs and the rural areas. Which party would that benefit? Probably the Democrat Party. As we saw so clearly in the election of 2016 and in much of the election of 2018, rural areas are dominated by Republicans. If Republicans from rural areas move to the cities or the closer suburbs, will they convert to Democrats? Probably not, but what will happen to their offspring? Over time, if such moves produced a change in party affiliation, it's more likely they will produce a change to the Democrat Party than to the Republican. Is that guaranteed? Absolutely not. Just as it would be foolhardy to assume that the voting tendencies of various ethnic groups in support of Democrats will not change, it would be foolhardy to assume that the urban and rural split between the parties will remain as it is, and that families forced into more urban areas by changes in transportation will necessarily vote Democrat. Having said that, the Republican Party must give serious thought to how it's going to handle the likely changes in our population's transportation and the resultant potential changes in population distribution. I will continue to give serious thought to the news and opinion I distribute through Political Spirits every week. Please join me for the next episode next week. Until then, be sure to tell your friends about Political Spirits, and follow me on Twitter at Franklin Rye. Like me on Facebook at Political Spirits. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.